Imagine this. You're sitting in a crowded cafe, watching the endless parade of human life unfold before you. Couples lean across tables, lost in animated conversation. Friends laugh over shared memories. Strangers swipe through their phones, hunting for connection in the digital wilderness. But then your eyes settle on him, a man sitting alone at the corner table, staring into his coffee as if it holds the answers to questions he's afraid to ask. He's not visibly broken. There are no tears, no dramatic displays of anguish. In fact, he looks perfectly ordinary, well-dressed, probably successful, the kind of man who appears to have his life together. Yet something in his posture, in the way he holds his shoulders like they're carrying an invisible weight, tells a different story. This is a man who has made peace with loneliness, not the temporary solitude that comes before love finds you, but the permanent kind, the kind that whispers, "This is just how things are now." You've seen him before, haven't you? Perhaps in your mirror. Here's the paradox that should disturb us all. We live in an age of unprecedented connectivity, yet more men than ever are silently withdrawing from the pursuit of love. Not with grand declarations of sworn bachelorhood or bitter manifestos against romance, but with something far more insidious, quiet resignation. They simply stop trying, stop hoping, stop believing that meaningful connection is possible for them. They vanish into a kind of emotional witness protection program, hiding in plain sight among us. But why? What invisible force has convinced an entire generation of men that love is not for them? The surface explanations feel familiar. Dating apps have turned romance into a marketplace. Social media has created impossible standards. Modern feminism has left men confused about their role. These are the symptoms everyone discusses, the obvious wounds we can point to and say, that's what's wrong. But symptoms are not causes, and the real disease runs much deeper than swipe fatigue or cultural confusion. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, writing in the 19th century, understood something about human despair that feels prophetic today. He spoke of a particular kind of suffering, not the dramatic despair of tragedy or loss, but what he called the sickness unto death. This is the despair that doesn't announce itself with screaming or weeping. It's the despair that wears a mask of normalcy, that gets up and goes to work, that laughs at jokes and pays bills and lives what appears to be a functional life. But underneath, the soul has quietly given up on its deepest longings. Kierkegaard would recognize the man in that cafe immediately. He would see in him the embodiment of modern despair, not the absence of desire, but the death of hope. The man still wants love. He's simply convinced himself it's impossible. He's trapped in what Kierkegaard called the despair of not willing to be oneself. The terrible resignation that occurs when we decide our authentic self is not worthy of being loved. But here's what should truly unsettle you. This man's resignation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow erosion, a gradual process of small defeats and subtle messages that accumulated like sediment until they formed an unshakable belief. Each unreturned text, each awkward silence, each moment of feeling invisible in a room full of people, these weren't just disappointments. They were data points in a case he was building against himself. The most tragic part? He's often wrong. The love he believes is impossible may be closer than he thinks. But his despair has become a self-fulfilling prophecy, a protective shell that keeps out both rejection and connection. He's chosen the certainty of loneliness over the uncertainty of vulnerability. This is not just one man's story. This is the hidden epidemic of our time, an entire generation of men who have quietly concluded that love is not their portion in life. They haven't become misogynists or given up on women. They've simply given up on themselves. And in doing so, they've created a silence so profound that even they don't recognize it as suffering. The question that should haunt us is not whether these men are right or wrong in their assessment. The question is, what kind of world have we created where hope itself feels naive? Before we dive deeper into this psychological and philosophical labyrinth, I want you to know that this exploration is based on careful analysis of contemporary patterns that echo Kierkegaard's timeless insights. The transcript that inspired this deep dive reveals the profound connection between 19th century existential philosophy and 20th century relationship dynamics. If this resonates with you, if you've felt this quiet desperation yourself or witnessed it in someone you care about, please share this with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the most powerful act of love is simply showing another person they are not alone in their struggle. Now, let's uncover the hidden forces that have created this epidemic of silent surrender. The roots of this modern masculine despair stretch far deeper than dating apps or social media. They reach into the very architecture of how we've constructed male identity in the 21st century. To understand why men are silently abandoning love, we must first understand the impossible contradiction they're asked to embody every day. Carl Jung warned us about the shadow those parts of ourselves we're taught to suppress, deny, or hide. For modern men, vulnerability has become their shadow. From childhood, they learn that emotional openness is weakness, that needing someone is failure, that asking for help is admitting defeat. Yet love, real, transformative love, demands exactly what they've been conditioned to fear most: the courage to be seen in their full humanity, flaws and fears included. This creates what Friedrich Nietzsche might have recognized as a fundamental tension between the will to power and the need for connection. Men are taught to be conquerors in every arena of life, career, fitness, achievement. But love cannot be conquered. It can only be received. And receiving requires a kind of surrender that feels antithetical to everything they've learned about being a man. Kierkegaard understood this paradox intimately. He wrote about the anxiety that comes from standing at the edge of possibility, that dizzying moment when we realize we have the freedom to choose authenticity or continue living a lie. For many men, the prospect of being truly seen feels more terrifying than remaining invisible. They've spent so long performing strength that they've forgotten how to access their genuine emotions. When relationships demand emotional intelligence they've never been taught to develop, they feel fundamentally inadequate. But there's something even more insidious at work here. What Arthur Schopenhauer called the hedgehog's dilemma. Hedgehogs need each other for warmth, but when they get too close, their spines hurt one another. So they're trapped in an endless dance of approach and withdrawal, never quite finding the perfect distance. Modern men experience this dilemma with devastating intensity. They desperately want connection but have been wounded so many times that intimacy feels dangerous. The digital age has amplified this hedgehog's dilemma exponentially. Dating apps promise infinite choice but deliver constant rejection. Social media showcases everyone else's highlight reels, while men struggle with their behind-the-scenes reality. They see couples who appear perfectly matched and wonder what's fundamentally wrong with them that they can't achieve the same effortless connection. Jean-Paul Sartre spoke of bad faith, the ways we lie to ourselves to avoid the anxiety of authentic existence. Many men have entered a state of romantic bad faith, convincing themselves they don't actually want what they desperately need. They tell themselves they're focusing on their career or enjoying the single life, when they're actually protecting themselves from the vulnerability that love requires. This self-deception serves a purpose. It provides the illusion of control. If you don't try, you can't fail. If you don't hope, you can't be disappointed. If you don't open your heart, it can't be broken. It's a perfectly logical response to perceived impossible odds, except that it guarantees the very outcome they fear most: a life without meaningful connection. Viktor Frankl observed that the primary human drive is not pleasure or power, but meaning. Men who have given up on love haven't just abandoned romance, they've abandoned one of the primary sources of meaning in human existence. They're left with careers, hobbies, and achievements that feel increasingly hollow because they have no one to share them with, no one who truly sees and celebrates who they are beneath their accomplishments. The tragedy is that these men often mistake their protective mechanisms for wisdom. They believe they've evolved beyond the neediness of wanting love, when in reality they've simply numbed themselves to their own deepest longings. They wear their emotional unavailability like armor, not realizing it's become their prison. This is the hidden problem Kierkegaard identified. When we refuse to be ourselves, when we choose the safety of inauthenticity over the risk of being known, we don't just miss out on love. We miss out on life itself. We become what he called the living dead, technically alive but spiritually dormant, going through the motions of existence without ever truly living. But understanding the problem is only the beginning. The deeper we dig into this masculine despair, the more we realize it's not just affecting individual men. It's reshaping the entire landscape of human connection in ways most of us haven't even begun to recognize. What happens when an entire generation of men quietly withdraws from the pursuit of love? The consequences ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves that touch every corner of society in ways both subtle and profound. First, Consider the women left wondering why the men around them seem emotionally unavailable, commitment phobic, or simply absent from the dating pool altogether. They're told it's because men are selfish, immature, or afraid of strong women. But the reality is more complex and more tragic. Many of these men aren't avoiding commitment because they don't want it. They're avoiding it because they don't believe they deserve it. They've internalized a narrative of inadequacy so deeply that they remove themselves from consideration before anyone else can. This creates what psychologists call a negative feedback loop. Women experience men as distant and unavailable. Men interpret women's frustration as confirmation that they're fundamentally unlovable. Both sides retreat further into defensive positions, creating exactly the disconnection both fear most. The very act of protecting themselves from rejection ensures its continuation. But the consequences go far beyond individual relationships. We're witnessing the emergence of what sociologist Sherry Turkle calls alone together, a society where people are physically present but emotionally isolated. Men who have given up on love often replace authentic connection with digital substitutes, endless scrolling, pornography, gaming, or parasocial relationships with influencers and streamers. These provide the illusion of connection without the risk of vulnerability. The neuroscience here is sobering. When we avoid genuine human connection, our brains literally rewire themselves. The neural pathways associated with empathy, emotional regulation, and social bonding begin to atrophy. What starts as a protective mechanism becomes a fundamental alteration in how these men process relationships. They don't just choose isolation over time, they become neurologically adapted to it. This adaptation creates what Aldous Huxley predicted in Brave New World, a soma-induced contentment that masks deeper suffering. Modern men have found their soma in endless distractions that provide just enough stimulation to avoid confronting their loneliness. They binge-watch series instead of building intimacy. They optimize their fitness routines instead of working on emotional intelligence. They master video games instead of learning the art of conversation. The cognitive bias at work here is what psychologists call learned helplessness. After repeated experiences of rejection or emotional unavailability from others, these men conclude that connection itself is impossible for them. They stop trying not because they lack desire, but because their brains have categorized love as an impossible goal, like trying to fly by flapping their arms. But perhaps the most insidious consequence is how this withdrawal affects their relationship with themselves. Kierkegaard understood that we cannot love others authentically until we've learned to face ourselves honestly. Men who have given up on love often stop the difficult work of self-examination. They avoid therapy, dismiss introspection as navel-gazing, and resist any activity that might reveal the depth of their longing or pain. This creates a kind of emotional arrested development. While these men may excel in their careers or hobbies, they remain emotionally adolescent, unable to process complex feelings, communicate vulnerably, or navigate the inevitable conflicts that come with intimate relationships. They become what psychologist Terence Real calls passive-aggressive avoidance, men who want connection but sabotage it whenever it gets too real. The cultural conditioning runs so deep that many don't even recognize their own patterns. They've been taught that needing someone is weakness, so they interpret their longing for connection as personal failure. They mistake emotional numbness for strength and isolation for independence. They become strangers to their own hearts. Society pays the price in ways we're only beginning to measure. Rising rates of depression and suicide among men. Declining birth rates as relationships become increasingly difficult to form and maintain. A generation of children growing up with emotionally unavailable fathers who repeat the cycle. Women bearing the emotional labor of entire relationships because their partners never learned how to show up emotionally. The tragedy is that this is entirely preventable. The men trapped in this pattern aren't fundamentally broken, they're responding rationally to irrational circumstances. They've been handed an impossible script. Be strong but vulnerable. Be confident but not arrogant. Be successful but not materialistic. Be emotionally available but not needy. When they inevitably fail to thread these contradictory needles, they conclude the problem is with them rather than with the script itself. But here's what should truly alarm us. This withdrawal is accelerating. Each generation of men seems more disconnected than the last, more resigned to emotional isolation, more convinced that authentic connection is beyond their reach. We're creating a world where loneliness becomes the default mode of existence rather than a temporary state to be overcome. The question is no longer whether this is a problem. The data is overwhelming. The question is whether we have the courage to challenge the very foundations of how we've taught men to exist in the world. Because if we don't, we're not just losing individual relationships, we're losing the capacity for human connection itself. But what if everything we've been told about this problem is backwards? What if the solution isn't teaching men to be more vulnerable or emotionally available? What if the real breakthrough comes from a complete inversion of how we understand love, strength, and masculine identity itself? Kierkegaard offers us a radical reframe that cuts through decades of relationship advice and cultural conditioning. He suggests that the men who have given up on love aren't weak. They're responding intelligently to a fundamentally flawed premise. The problem isn't that they lack courage. It's that they're trying to find courage in all the wrong places. Consider this. Every piece of modern dating advice tells men to put themselves out there, to be vulnerable, to take risks. But this advice assumes that love is something external to be pursued, captured, and secured. Kierkegaard understood something far more revolutionary, that love isn't something you get, it's something you become. And you can't become love while you're desperately chasing it. The men who have silently given up have actually stumbled onto a profound truth, though they've misinterpreted its meaning. They've realized that the conventional approach to love, the endless pursuit, the performance of desirability, the negotiation for affection, is fundamentally degrading to the human soul. Their withdrawal isn't cowardice. It's an unconscious rebellion against a system that treats love like a commodity to be earned rather than a state of being to be embodied. But here's where their rebellion becomes self-defeating. Instead of rejecting the system and creating a new one, they've simply removed themselves from the game entirely. They've thrown out the baby with the bathwater, abandoning love itself rather than abandoning the corrupt pursuit of love. The real rebellion, the one that actually works, requires what Kierkegaard called the leap of faith. But this isn't the leap into relationship that most people imagine. It's the leap into yourself. It's the radical act of deciding that you are inherently worthy of love, not because of what you achieve or how well you perform, but because worthiness is your birthright as a conscious being. This is where most relationship advice gets it catastrophically wrong. It focuses on making yourself more attractive to others rather than making yourself more attractive to yourself. It teaches technique rather than transformation. It offers strategies for winning love rather than strategies for being love. The men who break free from this cycle, and there are many, though their stories rarely get told, follow a different path entirely. They begin with what seems like the opposite of vulnerability. They become absolutely, unshakably grounded in their own value. Not arrogant. Arrogance is actually a form of insecurity. But genuinely, deeply convinced of their own worthiness of love. This isn't positive thinking or self-help mantras. This is what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of one's fate. It's the radical acceptance of yourself as you are, including your flaws, your past failures, your awkwardness, your fears. It's the recognition that you don't need to be different to be lovable. You need to be more authentically yourself. When a man reaches this state of self-acceptance, something remarkable happens. He stops needing love and starts expressing it. The desperate energy that once drove him to chase validation transforms into something magnetic, the quiet confidence of someone who knows who he is and likes what he sees. He becomes what the ancient Greeks called eudaimonic, flourishing from within rather than dependent on external circumstances. History is full of examples of men who embodied this principle. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations about finding peace through self-acceptance and duty to something greater than personal desires. Viktor Frankl discovered meaning in the concentration camps by focusing on what he could give rather than what he could get. Carl Jung found love by first making peace with his own shadow. But this path requires dismantling some of our most cherished cultural beliefs about masculinity and success. It means recognizing that the pressure to constantly prove yourself is not strength, it's a prison. It means understanding that the need for external validation is not ambition, it's addiction. It means accepting that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the foundation of genuine strength. The practical steps are counterintuitive. Instead of working on your dating profile, work on your relationship with solitude. Instead of learning pickup lines, learn to enjoy your own company. Instead of trying to become more interesting to others, become more interested in your own inner life. Instead of building muscles to attract partners, build character to attract yourself. This is what Kierkegaard meant by becoming yourself. It's not narcissism or selfishness, it's the recognition that you cannot give what you do not have. You cannot offer authentic love if you're performing for approval. You cannot create genuine connection if you're desperate to avoid abandonment. You cannot be truly present with another person if you're constantly monitoring their reaction to you. The men who master this approach discover something revolutionary. When you stop needing love, you become irresistibly attractive to the kind of people worth loving. When you're genuinely content with your own company, others want to join you. When you're not performing strength, your authentic power becomes magnetic. But this isn't the end of the story. There's one more layer to uncover a truth so fundamental that it transforms not just how we approach love, but how we understand the entire purpose of human existence. The men who truly break free don't just find love. They discover something far more profound. Here is the truth that changes everything. The men who silently give up on love are not broken. They are spiritual beings having a crisis of recognition. They have forgotten the most essential fact of their existence, that they were born not to receive love, but to be love itself. This isn't metaphysical speculation or spiritual bypassing. This is the deepest insight Kierkegaard ever offered, that every human being is called to embody the divine quality of unconditional love, not as a means to an end, but as the very purpose of existence itself. The men who have withdrawn from romantic pursuit have actually been called to something far greater, the recognition that they are not half beings seeking completion, but whole beings designed to overflow with love. Think about the profound shift this creates. Instead of seeing yourself as fundamentally lacking something that others must provide, you recognize yourself as fundamentally abundant, a source of love, rather than a recipient of it. Instead of approaching relationships from scarcity, will they love me? You approach from abundance. How can I love them? Instead of needing to be chosen, you choose to love regardless of outcome. This is what the mystics of every tradition have understood. Love is not an emotion or a transaction, it's a state of being. When Jesus said, "Love your neighbor as yourself," he wasn't giving relationship advice. He was revealing the fundamental structure of reality. When the Buddhists speak of compassion as the natural state of awakened consciousness, they're pointing to the same truth. When Sufi poets write about divine love consuming the ego, they're describing the transformation that occurs when we stop trying to get love and start being love. The men who reach this understanding undergo what can only be described as a complete reversal of their entire approach to existence. They stop asking, "Am I lovable?" and start asking, "How can I love more fully?" They stop measuring their worth by others' responses and start measuring it by the depth of their own compassion. They stop performing desirability and start expressing authenticity. And here's what happens, something that defies every cynical prediction about human nature. When a man truly embodies love rather than seeking it, he becomes magnetic in ways that have nothing to do with conventional attractiveness. He radiates a quality that people recognize instantly, but can rarely name the presence of someone who is complete in themselves and overflowing with goodness. This isn't because he's playing hard to get or using some psychological technique. It's because he's accessed what Kierkegaard called the eternal in man, that aspect of consciousness that exists beyond personal need, beyond ego, beyond the desperate calculations of desire and fear. He's found what the ancient Greeks called agape, unconditional love that asks nothing in return. But perhaps the most profound part of this transformation is what happens to his relationship with rejection and acceptance. When you know that your purpose is to love regardless of reciprocation, rejection stops being a judgment on your worth and becomes simply information about compatibility. When someone doesn't love you back, it doesn't diminish your value, it just means you're not meant to share your life with that particular person. This creates an extraordinary freedom. You can express interest without desperation. You can be vulnerable without neediness. You can pursue connection without attachment to outcome. You become what the Stoics called preferred indifferent to romantic results. You'd prefer love, but your happiness and self-worth aren't dependent on it. The men who reach this state often find that love arrives not when they're chasing it, but when they've stopped making it the center of their universe. Because they're no longer approaching potential partners from emptiness, trying to fill a void, they attract people who are also whole, also growing, also committed to love as a practice rather than love as a feeling. But even this isn't the deepest truth. The deepest truth is that whether romantic love arrives or not becomes irrelevant to their happiness. They found what every human being is actually seeking: not to be loved, but to love; not to be seen, but to see; not to be understood, but to understand. They've accessed what Kierkegaard called the passion of the infinite love, without conditions, limits, or requirements. This is why the men who have silently given up are actually closer to breakthrough than they realize. Their despair, their withdrawal, their quiet resignation, these aren't signs of defeat. They're the dark night of the soul that precedes awakening. They're the ego's last desperate attempt to maintain the illusion that love is something to be achieved rather than something to be expressed. The path forward isn't back into the dating world with better strategies or more confidence. The path forward is into yourself, into the recognition of what you actually are. Not a person who needs love, but love itself in human form. Not someone who lacks something essential, but someone who has always possessed everything necessary for complete fulfillment. When you truly understand this, not intellectually, but in your bones, in your breath, in the very core of your being, everything changes. You stop being a person who hopes to find love and become a person who brings love wherever you go. You stop being someone who might be worthy of affection and become someone who is affection itself. And in that transformation, you discover what Kierkegaard knew all along, that the greatest love stories aren't about two incomplete people finding completion in each other. They're about two whole people choosing to share their completeness. Two sources of love recognizing each other and deciding to flow together towards something even greater than themselves. This is the ultimate truth that can transform any man's relationship with love. You are not here to get loved. You are here to love. And when you finally understand the difference, the silence ends, the despair lifts, and you discover that you were never actually alone. You were just looking in the wrong direction. The question is no longer whether you are worthy of love. The question is whether you are ready to become love itself. And the answer to that question will determine not just your romantic future, but the entire trajectory of your existence. Are you ready to stop seeking and start being? The choice, as it always has been, is yours.